graduate program, which, by the way, went so freaking fast, didn't it? Yeah, and it's what always happens, you know, it goes so fast, and we sometimes forget to breathe a little bit. So today's one of those days where afterwards we get to breathe a little bit. That'll be kind of nice. So first presentation coming up is Lydia's. So all of you know this, but Lydia graduated from CC a year ago, and her research, from what I can tell and read through this, is a little bit of an extension of some of her undergraduate work, and one of several topics today that really kind of does focus on the important affective domain of our elementary learners, which, as you know, is a very difficult topic to try to dive into and understand. So Lydia's presentation on the effect of Palacio's wonder on fourth grade students' empathy is undoubtedly going to be insightful. So Lydia, here you go.
Thank you, Mike. Put this up here. Let me just get situated for a moment. So I'm really excited to be here today. I'm happy that we are all finally getting to present our master's research papers that we've been working for so long on. I think I'm actually going to use this and move around. Does that work? Yeah, cool. Okay. Actually, I changed my mind. I'm going to stay back here. All right. So like Mike said, I decided to research this year the impacts or the effect of narrative fiction on fourth grade students' empathy. This research is really important to me because empathy is a central tenet to my own teacher identity, and it's really where my actions and my decision making as a teacher is rooted in. So in today's current educational climate, I think all of us teachers and professors can attest that there is this kind of massive stress on testing and standardized testing and meeting certain benchmarks and getting our students there. So this enormous pressure I've seen in my student teaching experiences and in speaking with other teachers around Colorado Springs and the country, this massive pressure in a lot of ways is distorting our children's school experiences because we are becoming so hyper-focused on meeting these benchmarks and making tangible growth. Our schools have become so focused, though, on this growth because our schools are defined practically by our students' test scores. Our students are labeled as red, yellow, green, blue for high achieving. And those labels are really taking a toll on our students because our students aren't getting the development or the attention that they need in their social emotional aspect of themselves as beings. So I think President Obama, or Barack Obama, excuse me, in 2007 said it best, that our country, the biggest deficit we see in our country today, or in the world today, is an empathy deficit. We're lacking the ability to feel with and understand other beings. So I really focused my research on what can I do? How can I help this decrease or decline this empathy deficit that exists in today's world? So the question that I asked was, does reading narrative fiction in conjunction with perspective activities and empathy activities increase my fourth grade students' empathy? Our agenda today, first things first, I will walk you through a little bit of the existing research. There isn't very much existing research on this topic. I will talk about my classroom and the school in which I've been working in. I will talk about the methods, results, and implications of my research. So the existing research today, can you guys hear me? Is this fine? Okay. So the existing research on empathy and narrative fiction is pretty limited. There are some studies on the ways in which narrative fiction influences adults' empathy or ability to empathize. But with regards to children, the research is super limited. It's lacking. There have been two studies by Gorisco and Freeman, and then by Gorisco, Brooks, and Freeman in 2015 and 2017 that looked into how reading the novel Wonder, which is actually what my students read too, how reading the novel Wonder affected their students' empathy. What came from that research was that cognitive empathy, which is the ability to understand the emotions or the perspectives of another person. Cognitive empathy was increased when students read Wonder, but it was actually decreased when the second half of their class read a book called The Crossover, which was also a narrative fictional text. So these were kind of interesting, conflicting results that these researchers found, and I took it upon myself to really dive into my classroom and into my students and curriculum to see if narrative fiction in my classroom would maybe perhaps have an influence or affect my students' empathy. So real quick, I'll touch on my school demographics just to give you some context for where I've been working this year. Here is the racial and ethnic makeup of the student body at my school. As you can see, we are the majority Hispanic or Latino. 54% of students identify as Hispanic or Latino, 21% identify as white, and 14% identify as Black or African American. And then with regards to programs and centers at Mountain Vista Community School, which is where I've been working this year, 72% of students receive free and reduced lunch, which indicates that I teach at a school with low socioeconomic status. I don't know if I said that right. English language learners, there are 36%, so that's a pretty large number of English language learners at my school. And then 17% of students are enrolled in special education programs. Okay, so my study. I took a mixed methods approach to investigating how narrative fiction can influence empathy in my students. First things first, I delivered a empathy questionnaire for children and adolescents. This is a valid and reliable instrument that's used across the world. It's pretty new though, so that is a limitation. But this instrument has 3 components. It measures 3 kind of domains of empathy. The first domain is affective empathy. So that means kind of the ability to feel for another, or feel with another person. So when you're sad, I feel sad too. I gave an example of a kind of question that my students were asked to rate themselves on from 0, or either 1, 2, or 3, my bad. The second domain of empathy is cognitive empathy, so the understanding of another person's emotions or perspectives. And then the third aspect is the intention to help. That's how inclined you are to kind of act upon maybe seeing someone in distress. I gave these questionnaires to 46 of my 60 students, actually ended up participating. And I gave this questionnaire as a pre-test and as a post-test, before my unit and after. Case studies, so I chose 8 students of mine to participate in kind of the case study exploration in my research. These 8 students were a pretty representative sample of the diverse learners in my classroom. So I had some English language learners, I had some students who are on IEPs, students who are kind of either below grade level or at grade level, and then students who are higher achieving too. So I tried to get a really representative sample in there. Throughout the unit, I gave them kind of short answer prompts so that they could explain their empathy within those 3 domains. So up here, I won't read them, but I gave some examples of the kinds of questions or short answer questions that I asked my students to respond to. And they responded just with written kind of journal entry responses. And then the third kind of component of my research was just the novel study itself that we did with the novel Wonder. So my students were grouped in triads, mixed ability triads. So we had one student who was performing or reading below grade level, one student who's reading on grade level, and one student who's reading above. And they read this novel 3 days a week. They completed these Wonder Reader's Guides that I created. Sorry, the time threw me off. They completed these Wonder Reader's Guides that I gave them to complete these discussion questions, notice and note signposts, which are for reading comprehension, and there's a mystery box for additional work. We also completed this kind of investigation of each character. So this novel is really unique because it's told from 6 different characters' perspectives. So we really dove into the perspective of each character, with regards to the different events that happen in the book. And what we took from these character days, we called them, was that no two characters saw the same events the same way. So my results, what did I find? My questionnaire data proved to show that there was a large, significant difference in students pre-test and post-test with regard to their empathy in the 3 domains. So this is really important because the existing research doesn't show that elementary students are influenced by reading narrative fiction, that their empathy is influenced by reading narrative fiction. So my research is pretty unique. I can't claim that there is a causal relationship between my novel study and the results of the empathy questionnaire or the growth of the empathy in my students, but I think it is safe to say that I've noticed, or that there is my novel study has influenced the empathy in my students. This leads me into the qualitative side of part of my research. With my case studies, as you can see up here from some of these examples, my students' language became much more rich in terms of discussing their emotions, discussing their empathic feelings for other people. So in the beginning, if they were just saying they felt sad for a character, by the end they were saying they were depressed and they were inclined to go home and hold their dog and pet their dog because the main character's dog passed away. Or they cried a waterfall of tears, etc. So their vocabulary was really enriched by this unit, and that is probably telling of their understanding of their own emotions or being in touch with their own empathic emotions by participating in this novel study. An area for future research researchers could potentially look into gender as it is affected by reading narrative fiction. It's interesting that females scored themselves higher on affective empathy and cognitive empathy, both on the pre-test and post-test, but those weren't significant differences, so that could be an area for future investigation. And then implications of this research. I think that first things first, I don't have it up there, but in this day and age, it's really important to take a look around us and the world around us and realize the impact that we can have as teachers. And realize, like as I mentioned in the beginning, that the impact that we make on our students by just teaching to the test and just teaching the rote curriculum can really harm our students in terms of social and emotional growth. So it's so important to embed this social emotional learning into our curriculum. Look at if you turn on the news every single morning, we see increasing reports of racial profiling, of insensitive policies, divisive policies. Our students are the future, so it's our job as teachers and as educators, and just as beings in this country, to help people learn to understand and feel with other people. Moving forward in my practice, I'm going to always try and incorporate narrative fiction. Next year I'm teaching all 4 disciplines, but I've been reading a book by Lent that Tina pointed me towards called, I think, This is Disciplinary Literacy. I'm sorry, thank you, Tina. This is Disciplinary Literacy, and it's really taught me that in all disciplines, you can incorporate storytelling and narrative fiction, whether that be using math vocabulary in math class, or whether that be having kids create their own science stories using your science curriculum that you're using. But it's really, there's a lot of potential for narrative fiction in all realms of education. Also, I think it's important that I practice mixed ability grouping that help my students develop their empathy even in their practice in the classroom. And then lastly, it's super important to create a positive culture where students feel safe to show their emotions. I think that my research was, in part, very significant because of the kind of culture that I facilitated with my students. So I will wrap it up by saying thank you to Tina, Mark Saviano, and Alyssa Liberty, my co-teacher. And I will open up for any questions that you guys might have.
In Howard's absence, I've become the question.
Yes.
Why do you think you got the results you got?
So there's this theory that's actually been proven called transportation theory, and I didn't have time to really discuss it in the presentation today, but humans are shown to, when they read narrative fiction, their empathy is shown to increase when they are transported into a novel or when they are brought into this novel. So my students, I think, identified with this character because he was a 5th grader. So they identified with the main character in the novel. They identified with some of the struggles that he was going through with his family, with being excluded, with his dog passing away. So being able to identify with the book, I think, is so important in terms of developing one's empathy through narrative fiction. So I think that played a major role. Also, like I said, just the culture that was created and the discussions that we had about bullying, about accepting one another, about real world issues that are going on today. I think just that culture that was facilitated and was begun by reading this book really allowed for these students' empathic growth and those significant results. Mike?
So within the demographics that you worked with, did you notice any differences among those students, whether it was ELL, and non, high achieving, low, in terms of their change in their
Nothing significant, even from like my qualitative observations that I noticed. The only thing that I will say about that is that my students who tended to be very apathetic at the beginning of this unit with regards to the curriculum that we were teaching and just the content, the students who would sit there and refuse to do work, I can think of like 5 off the top of my head, became so much more engaged through this unit because I was touching on something that was important to them, whether that was their relationships with their friends, whether that was hardships that we have to overcome. So those students who were apathetic, I think I saw a lot of growth in it. The students who were apathetic typically were my lower achieving or mid achieving students. So that was really interesting too to see.
I think we're done right now.